and you'll get that message saying this meeting is being recorded, etc. And finally, we've said this several times, we talk about our benevolent fund. We've been through 18 months of hell and we hope we're coming out of it now, etc. But Amazon have kindly, if you want to subscribe, if you go on to www.smile.amazon.co.uk, they will contribute anything you buy from that particular website, 0.5% to our benevolent fund for people less off than you and I. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter Williams, our treasurer, to introduce our speaker for today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Not a lot of people know that David was my boss 20 plus years ago, giving me work at BNFL, for which I will be eternally grateful. His last presentation to the branch was during his time at the sharp end of the probation service, notably dealing with one of the favourites of the justice system, one Stephen French. Now he's a magistrate. I almost said I was going to say he's a beak on the bench, but I won't. I'm sure the presentation will be an entertaining and informative session. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I'm using a package called Mentimeter. Hopefully you can all see that. Can you all see that? I'll just... so at the top, you'll see there's a number. If you go onto a website, menti.com, and you type in that 8-digit number, that number will be on all of the slides as we go through. So then you will be able to vote and participate in the presentation. It is fully interactive, which is very scary because I sometimes have no idea what's going to happen when people vote. So the original title was indeed Health and Safety in the Higher Education Sector. Peter, the PR man that he is, said that that wasn't quite catchy enough. So we went for from the classroom to the bench. So I'm hoping just to draw on some of my experience, both within the higher education sector, but elsewhere, and just sort of prompt you in terms of risk and risk management and health and safety management in the situation that we find ourselves in today. So that's the background. There is Bolton University, and hopefully this is going to play ball with me. There we are to the bench. I sit at Manchester Magistrates Court, but also in Bolton and Stockport and Wigan, but thankfully not all at the same time. So start off with to see who has managed to log in. We'll start off with a bit of a poll. Okay, so if you go on to menti.com and put in that number, then you can vote as to whether you attended, you haven't attended university, or it was so good you can't remember. We got 5. Six votes so far. Give you a couple. 7. So we've got a few here who've attended. Obviously, nobody's had the experience, which is so mind-blowing that they can't remember they were there. Right. So obviously, I work in the higher education sector, which is quite interesting from a health and safety point of view, as we'll see, because there are a number of elements to managing health and safety within our sector, which are perhaps different to a normal workplace. Okay, and so we'll go for the next question, which is, what's your experience of court? Attended, haven't attended, or your legal advice is no comment? So the court system, obviously, I sit as a JP and see a wide variety of different cases. I do criminal law. There's also family and youth, but I stick to criminal. And what's really interesting is, as we will come on to look at the rest of this presentation, you know, how people balance risk with with what they hope to get out of a particular endeavor, and sometimes their expectations about what the outcome might be. Okay. So some of my background. So I started as Peter has alluded to, in the nuclear industry. Worked in BNFL, as was then, is now Sellafield Limited, for 11 or 12 years, and did a wide range of things, including some commercial work, but also facility management, and began to move into the safety field in the latter years of my career. And then moved to the probation service. And so I was the health and safety advisor for Merseyside Probation. And we did indeed have Mr. French at one point on the books. And say last time was presenting, then I did a bit in terms of the risks associated with dealing with dangerous people. I always think that this was sort of dangerous chemicals to dangerous people. I left there and went into further education to teach the NEBOSH diploma, amongst other things, in St Helens and Stoke, a number of other colleges. And then from there, I've moved into higher education. So I'm the health and safety manager for Bolton University. So Bolton, one of the newer universities, by no means the smallest or the newest, was Bolton Institute of Technology. For a long time, we became a university formally, I suppose, 15 years ago. But actually we can trace our roots back to the late 1800s, as the institute was set up to train industrial workers for the cotton and linen industry. So we've always had a very strong focus on vocational education. Because I wasn't allowed to be a magistrate whilst I worked in the probation service. Working in the probation service is what's known as a prohibited activity for a magistrate. Then I applied, I think it was 2 days after I left, to become a magistrate. So I've been a magistrate now for 5 years, and I've probably now done maybe 200 sittings, I should think. That is unpaid. So technically I'm not an employee. So when magistrates were told they had to leave and had to retire at 70, they went to judicial review for age discrimination, to which we were told, actually, there's no age discrimination because you aren't an employee, so you're not covered by employment law. So, do you think they're all the same, or do you think they're essentially different or the same? Let's have a vote, those different areas, from a safety point of view. Oh, 12. Marvelous. So I suppose that's an unfair question because both answers are right. So you can give yourself a pat on the back if you voted for different or you voted for the same. So somebody puts in different, that's great. So what do I mean? Well, obviously at a fundamental level, then everything, all of our workplaces are the same. They are governed by the same Health and Safety at Work Act. And clearly, even as a magistrate, as a non-employee, there are duties towards me. But clearly, those different workplaces have different challenges and different focuses. So some may focus specific more on risk, some may be highly regulated, some may just use the banner of safety first, some may focus more on the health side of health and safety, and in particular mental health at this time. So it'll be interesting, you should be able to just click on the picture and pin where your particular organization focuses. Is it on risk or regulation, or what? What's our kind of spread here? Should be able to just click. We've got some risk from there. That's good. Some more risk. Work safety. Oh, regulation. I've never used the pin on the image type of slide before, so I wasn't sure how that was going to work, but so working safely and risk, but obviously looking towards regulation as well. We can't escape that requirement to meet the regulatory requirements associated with our particular role and associated with the particular industry within which we are working. Just give you a couple more seconds to got 9 votes so far, so a fairly good split. So in many ways, what we're looking at here is risk, and we're looking at controls associated with that risk. We're looking at the rules, if you want, the control measures, be they regulatory or be they non-regulatory, which are trying to ensure that we manage that risk to as low as reasonably practicable, which is obviously what our entire reason for being as health and safety managers and health and safety advisors is. Now, within the nuclear industry, what's really curious about this is that it is obviously a very, very highly regulated industry. So a lot of legal requirements, a lot of time spent, and in fact it was one of the jobs that that Peter did for me, looking at what regulations and how we complied, compliance management against a whole range of different requirements imposed by law primarily. And so that produces a particular type of workforce and particular type of culture, if you want. It enforces a high degree of compliance because there is severe legal sanctions for breaking any of these regulations, both at an individual but also at a corporate level. Now, what we found, it was kind of interesting in terms of what's happened more recently, is that within that kind of high degree of compliance environment, when people were off site, then they almost sort of let rip. They felt as though, if you want, there was a requirement to balance your overall experienced risk, your overall experienced risk. So people who were very, very, very compliant on site would then tear up and down the motorways and do all sorts of extraordinarily dangerous things outside site. It was almost as though the individual had to balance what was going on within work, a very tightly controlled environment, with what was going on outside. So then we had probation. So I moved into the probation service, and clearly there is less regulation and much more to do with judgment. So because you're not really dealing with dangers which are easily understood, you are dealing with dangerous people, and people are very, very complex and have a whole series of different motivations, which means that what they may be presenting to you might not be entirely the truth. Now, overall, we had pretty good compliance in terms of people following the rules broadly. But people began, I was felt, to take unnecessary risks within the organization because people began to get to know individuals and began to let their guard down. And so, you know, we moved from people saying, well, I've got to work in a very secure environment to, oh, well, I've known this guy for ages, you know, I can interview him in my office with no security procedures at all. So again, a kind of an understanding of risk, but perhaps a watering down of risk and risk. But in higher education, things are a little bit different. So within higher education, we have clearly a lot of students. Now, Bolton is unusual in terms of its demography. So if you think of a sort of classic student, they are probably between 18 and 21. They have left sixth form or college, and this is the first time they have ventured away to university. Now, in Bolton, we have a slightly different spread. So around about 60 or 70% of our students come directly from the Bolton area. So it's not a huge kind of rite of passage leaving home and going to higher education. So that has an effect on how our students behave. Secondly, we have a quite high proportion of mature students. I do like to tell my counterparts in other universities that probably means that they have a high proportion of immature students, which they don't necessarily take kindly to. But a high proportion of mature students, and a mature student is somebody who's over 25, and about 35% of our students are over 25. A large proportion of our students actually have left school, have gone into non-graduate work, have perhaps started a family or whatever, and then take the opportunity slightly later in life than is classically known to start studying. And that means that they have a whole series of other issues in the background. And some of the issues that classically within higher education HEIs face are not as problematic for us. And so we have the three main areas of risk within higher education. I would suggest are accommodation, teaching, and research. So before I talk about those, a straw poll, which of those do you think poses the highest risk? Do you think it's accommodation, student teaching, or research, primarily postgraduate? So that's an interesting split. Accommodation, slightly higher there than research. Research got a few votes, and somebody's put teaching down as well. And I think I would agree with that split. Accommodation does pose a significant risk, and it is certainly a major issue for our larger universities in Greater Manchester. where you have huge accommodation blocks. And this is not simply because of COVID, which we'll come to in a moment, but because of other more conventional risks. Now, within Bolton, we are teach intensive. We do less research than teaching, but certainly, as we'll come on to see in a moment, research has its own particular issues when you're trying to push the boundary of science in a particular area. Some accommodation. So this was less than 6 months after I started in Bolton, and some of you may remember this. I think I better freeze frame on that. There, the University of Bolton said the building was owned and managed by a private landlord, and that is indeed the case. So this was owned and managed by Urban Student Living, but the effect of that was that 200 of our students are made homeless. Thankfully, there were only 2 minor injuries. So over 200 students made homeless. It wasn't our responsibility to do anything about that, but clearly we have a duty of care. I'm not necessarily talking about a legal duty of care, but they are our students, and these tended to be the ones that had actually moved from elsewhere in the country, or indeed international students, and we had to try and deal with all these people out on the street, traumatized as well. It was quite literally a baptism of fire for me. I had started in July of that year, and by November we'd already had a flood, inspection by the Office for Students, and a fire. I was beginning to take this personally. So the building had cladding, and of course that prompted once again a review of all of the buildings over 18 meters, which has caused a national issue, particularly for those accommodation blocks that are not student accommodation blocks, but where people have bought their accommodation and now faced with bills greater perhaps than the value of the original flat. After a long investigation by the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue, it was determined that this was caused by a cigarette which was discarded on a pile of other cigarettes on a mezzanine floor or a balcony, and that's what started it. There were all sorts of other concerns that were raised, and the report is available to read online about fire measures and fire evacuation. We were, and the students were, very, very fortunate that this happened at about 9 or 10 o'clock on a Friday night, when most of those students were actually out of the accommodation. If it had happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, we might be talking about an entirely different thing. It was election time, so we did have 1 or 2 visitors, and you can see that behind the line of people with their phones filming this momentous occasion, we had an awful lot of donations. That was the first night, which we coordinated. Teaching. Well, teaching has its own particular risks, but if you're sat in a big hall, then the risks are pretty low. It slips, trips and falls. But we are about to move into medicine. So we're in the process of building a large medical college of medical sciences, and within 5 years we should have a medical school, school of medicine. And that obviously prompts a whole series of other issues around biological safety, and not least the ethical areas associated with this, but biological safety, disposal of biological waste, which currently we are putting in place, along with an extensive application to the Human Tissue Authority. So teaching can itself be quite complex. At the moment, we're in relatively safe ground, but that is going to get much more complicated over the next few years. And then we have research. Now, of course, with research, then you're relying on people making a fine judgment balance between what is new and exciting and what remains safe. And that balance can be very difficult at times, because in research you are, of course, doing something which nobody else has done, perhaps. And so how do you plan and how do you suitably risk assess that? What we do find is that as soon as an individual gets their degree and becomes a postgrad, then suddenly they believe that they are competent and experienced in using every single piece of equipment that they weren't competent in using only 2 months before as an undergrad. So that is certainly an issue that we have to face, that as soon as you make somebody a PhD student or a master's student, then they can have a sense of their own competence which considerably exceeds what their real competence is. And it is trying to ensure that you're directing those research students, but also to ensure that there is an underpinning level of safety, even though, as I say, you might be doing something which is unusual and which is novel. So the rules for research have to rely on those people understanding the balance between risk and results, risks and controls, trying to have a clear understanding as to what the potential risks might be of something which is new and novel. Sometimes explaining that balance, you hit a brick wall, and this is this particular incident happened just before I joined the Bolton University, so I can't take any credit or any blame for this one. So this was a £750,000 hand-built supercar that was being developed, and to cut a very long story short, a technician got into the car. He'd never driven the car before, and decided to take it for a spin around the staff car park for reasons which we don't need to go into now. He lost control and totaled it on a brick wall. If you want to see it, it's still on the Mail Online website. So sometimes, even when all the measures are in place and even when people understand the risks, still people do stupid things. So how do we try and approach this? Well, clearly, as I say, I used to teach the diploma and training, and the diploma in particular are important in terms of understanding what the issues might be and giving people a toolkit to be able to make reasonable judgments. But obviously I also sit as a magistrate enforcing the breaking of rules, and not just health and safety ones, but rules for all sorts of different things. And you would be surprised, perhaps you wouldn't, at the number of defendants who turn up who have absolutely no idea that what they did was wrong, or that they didn't think that there would be any consequences associated with their activity. And just as a side note, I had an individual who had this is within traffic, an individual who had a perfectly clean driving license, went through a speed camera, decided that it really wasn't necessary for him to tell us who was driving the car, and he ended up with 6 points and £1,000 fine. And this look on his face was deep shock. I just didn't fill in a piece of paper. What's the possible consequence of that? So we've been talking about conventional safety primarily to this point, but let's talk about, if you want, the elephant in the room. And that is, of course, COVID. So I'm interested to see what your views are as to whether you think the experience of the pandemic in workplaces has made health and safety management easier or more difficult. Some votes coming in for easier now. So across the 13 people who voted so far, it's slightly tipping towards more difficult, but perhaps overall hasn't made an awful lot of difference. Now, my view actually is that it's made it easier, and I'll come to that in a second. Now, I do realise I'm a magistrate, but the voting here is completely anonymous. Be honest, how often did you break the COVID-19 regulations? One paragon of virtue here. Oh, lots of them. So I'm sure that if I gave this to some of my university audiences, then it would be skewed way over towards frequently. And I'm glad the people here today who are in large part managing health and safety management regulations and ensuring compliance have broadly complied with the regulations. Now, my view is that there is a crossover between how we've managed COVID and how we manage health and safety. How have you approached each of these four in your workplace? So for face coverings, did you have a lot of explanation and a lot of enforcement, or a lot of explanation and very little enforcement? For social distancing, same kind of thing, hand washing, self-isolation. Oh, one set of results going in, second set of results. So at the moment, it's looking as though most people have spent a lot of time on the explanation side of all four of these elements, perhaps with enforcement being a significant but not an overriding issue. Perhaps enforcement for face coverings, it's looking like slightly stronger than enforcement for some of the other areas, for example, social distancing, but all within the same sort of range. Now, within the university, we had to make a decision in terms of how we were going to manage COVID and how we were going to manage COVID on campus when we had students on campus. It was much easier when there was nobody there, obviously. So our first principle, we was going to treat the students as adults, and that might seem like a tautology, but it isn't. But what we tried to do as a university was engage with the students through the Students' Union and through student services to enable them to understand why we were putting particular measures in place. So that is certainly the explanation, and also for our staff, but for the students in particular. So as part of that, explaining the measures and really emphasizing social responsibility. So for face coverings, as an example, then we concentrated on ensuring that people understood why face coverings were important and why face coverings were important within within indoor environments in particular, as a way in which we could, as a community, as a university community, be responsible for ourselves and for the wider environment. And all the students signed a student pledge, which included commitments that those students made to behave in a socially responsible way, particularly with regard to COVID, both on campus but also outside in the general public area, in the town, whatever. So the emphasis was very much on caring for one another, and clearly people did not wear face coverings every so often, and so you would then approach that member of staff or student and try to explain to them why that was important. Clearly there were people with medical exemptions, but very, very, very few, as it turned out. Now, that wasn't necessarily the approach that was adopted across the HEI sector. Some of our colleagues treated the students as, well, older children. And so that meant that whilst they did explain the measures, it was much more around enforcement. So there are a number of institutions that had security people going around checking that people were wearing face coverings, checking that they had taken a lateral flow test, checking this, checking that, and checking the other. And indeed, excluding students from particular services, so not being able to go into the library, not being able to go into the gym, not being able to go here, there, and everywhere, if you could not show compliance with the regulations. Now, the institutions that tried this had mixed results, and we'll come on to what those mixed results were. So our approach worked quite well, the kind of social responsibility, whilst there was an underpinning legislative framework. So within Bolton, as you may be aware, we had our own regulations, our own very special Bolton coronavirus regulations, which was not necessarily something that we wanted, but with that underpinning, then emphasizing social responsibility on campus was relatively straightforward. Some of the other universities went for a different approach, where it was very much enforcement heavy. And that meant that they got good compliance, but they got conflict, people refusing to do things, and you only need to look at some of the conflict and aggression, actually, that happens in some of the central Manchester universities during COVID, and how people felt they were being treated. But it was easier for them to continue with those measures if they chose to, because it was an enforcement framework. As soon as the legislation disappeared, then it was much more difficult to use the soft approach that we were. And so our measures were withdrawn fairly quickly because they became unenforceable. So what has been our key learning, really? So what we've found is that in general, people don't break, they only break the rules if they have a particular reason to do so. I find this in magistrates' court. Very rarely do you have an offender who will turn up and say, well, I just did this for the hell of it. I've no idea why I stole the car. I've no idea why I shoplifted. There's usually a reason for it. And there's usually a reason for breaking the rules, both in COVID, but both in health and safety in more general terms. But actually, providing that underpinning understanding of why you're doing something, and sometimes the consequence associated with that, is really a really powerful argument. And so my view is that COVID-19, certainly within the university sector, will actually make health and safety management easier, because we've now got a kind of vocabulary and an understanding that a lot of students and indeed staff didn't have before. So risk is a more common concept. So you understand the risk of catching COVID. And so it is a relatively small leap to understand what the risks is associated with whatever the activity is. Controls. So you've got to have a one-way system. You've got to wear your face coverings. You've got to do this. You've got to, stand 2 meters apart. Whilst people haven't liked that, with the explanation as to why they were doing it, compliance was pretty good. And so we're going to try and use that approach again, rather than the heavy-handed, you shall do this, you shan't do that. PPE. Okay, face coverings isn't PPE, but actually people now have the experience of wearing something. And so actually relating that to people wearing proper PPE, I think will be a shorter leap. And giving them that information enables them to make the better choices, the safer choices, particularly for our postgrads that are perhaps less supervised than our undergrads, so that they understand why they're doing something rather than just slavishly following instructions from their supervisor. So what we have seen is a cultural change across the campus, and I'm hoping to build on that to produce a more wider health and safety cultural change. So now I'm going to hand back to Michelle, if I can stop sharing. There we are.
Oh, thanks, David. Some really interesting things there that certainly as part of my job I wouldn't even enter my head, but yeah, some interesting things. So there's a couple of questions there. Peter, you had one about the impact on student unions. I think we're talking about the fire here.
Oh, with respect to the fire. Yeah, so with respect to the fire, then student union was very actively involved. We had a serious problem. So the problem was that we had literally 220 students out on the street, and if we just relied on the private landlord, they'd probably still be sleeping on the street. So we sort of got into action. The Students' Union were absolutely essential in terms of providing support to students and to traumatized students. So it was really a three-pronged attack. So the university, through the Vice-Chancellor, provided a lot of practical help. The community rallied round and gave so much charitable stuff. I mean, it looked like you know, a sale in Debenhams or something, or BHS, or, well, they're all closed now, aren't they? But it looked like a closed sale. And then the Students' Union providing support. But we had all sorts of different agencies. We had the Passport Agency, and we had up because a number of students lost their passports. We had immigration services up to produce replicas or replacement visas, which had gone up in smoke. So all sorts of different things that that provided support to them, and the Students' Union was really important in that.
Is that okay for you, Peter, as an answer?
Yeah, that's one side of it. The other side of it was when I was the safety officer for the Liverpool Polytechnic, as it was, I was called out to look at something in the Student Union building, and that was a metal grating suspended from the ceiling, on which there were lamps on the dance hall, so people.
Oh, right.
Dance. And you're ahead of me, I think, on this one, David. Students are very good at clambering onto things. And I wasn't at all sure whether this thing was risk assessed to take the weight of a number of students swinging on it and then it descending on the people below. So I don't know whether you've had similar sort of situations to deal with.
Well, we have the advantage, if you want. The Students' Union perhaps would say it was a disadvantage, that their accommodation is part of the university buildings. So a number of universities have a separate Students' Union building, which causes its own problems. So they're within our kind of auspices. We have a strange student group. Our bar doesn't even sell beer. We have because nobody buys it. And I tell my counterparts in Greater Manchester, and they say, sorry, what? The nursing students, of which we have a lot, drink white wine. We sell quite a lot of that. But we don't have the big accommodation parties that Manchester University have. So they don't go very wild, really. Very well behaved, most of our students.
You are blessed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I think Will, do you want to come in? I think you had one that you wanted to ask. You're on mute.
Oh, you're on mute.
You're chatting away, Will. You're on mute.
It's an excellent question. If I could lip read.
Seem to be working.
Hi, David.
There we are.
Yeah, how's it going? Do all the buildings that are linked to the universities, are they all audited by the university management for, you know, compliance through fire regulations? Have they got enough accesses? You know, is there suitable means of fighting a fire? Cladding, you know, are they actually done, or
Yes.
as it was said, do we rely on the landlord to provide suitable risk assessment and everything for them? It was just wondering, you know, are they governed like many other buildings?
Sure. So we've got two elements to that. So the actual owned and run university buildings, so those are the ones on campus, they're all under our control. We audit them. In terms of accommodation, we used to own one accommodation block, and we still actually own the building, although it's in the process of being sold to a private provider, and the private provider currently manages the facility. In terms of safety, so they are in control of the building, but following both Grenfell and the Cube, the Department of Education has gone round and independently audited all accommodation blocks, and that includes the private providers. So we have been visited and provided information in terms of Orlando Village, which say we used to run but still own, but also there are 2 other completely privately owned blocks, which are being the Department of Education auditors are ensuring that the landlords are meeting their legal obligations, and I think fire service are also taking a much closer eye. There was concerns, let's put it as this is being recorded, that there were concerns about the cube, and there were concerns about some of the raised by some of the people who evacuated the cube, about provision of fire extinguishers and alarms and so on, which have been addressed with urgent student living. The difficulty with some of these houses of multiple occupancy is that when that fire happened, and if you went onto Google Maps, you will see the cube, urban student living, and you think that block is owned by urban student living. It's not.
Yeah.
Each student flat is owned by a different person. Some of them live in the Cayman Islands, some of them live in the Isle of Man, some of them live in Germany, some of them live in Texas. They live all over the place because they are investment opportunities. They have bought that flat from urban student living, and they are then, USL then gathers the rent, takes a proportion of that, provides the remainder to the landlord. That makes making changes to those kind of buildings really difficult, because you can have dozens and dozens of landlords.
Yeah, it leaves you with a bit of a nightmare then, doesn't it? So you can actually buy one of the students' accommodations to sublet to other people.
To students.
I didn't know that. Yeah. Know that.
And so when the fire took place, DFE contacted all of the universities and said, can you write to all the landlords and ensure that they have met their statutory fire requirements?
Yeah.
Which on the face of it sounded pretty good, until we realized that there were hundreds of landlords.
You were never going to get hold of all of them, were you?
Right. And a managing agent. And so, and the managing agent said, hey, we just collect the rent. We don't actually own these places. So that became a really difficult issue.
Yeah, God, yeah, that was quite interesting, that, because I mean, I was under the illusion that obviously any university buildings, obviously you would imagine are owned by the university. I didn't know.
So the big blocks in Manchester, they all tended to have been built sometimes by the university, which has caused Manchester huge financial problems last year because they were empty. But the ones which are built by private companies to start with are often then subletted.
Because it's quite a lucrative business, the students' accommodation, isn't it? Unfortunately. Absolutely. I mean, and when you look around like some of the little suppliers, like where Chester Uni is, and you get like all the little sublets, and every other one has got student accommodation. So, you know,
it just becomes very, very difficult in terms of pinning down who's responsible.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Cheers.
Have a little cheeky one from me, David.
Please do.
So what's the situation with your fire risk assessment then, if you haven't got full control?
So the fire risk assessments for Orlando, for example, which, as I say, we have the infrastructure, but they run it, is owned and written by McCombs Limited, who run it. So they are the controlling party, and they are the responsible person under the legislation. For all of the rest of our buildings on campus, then we are, and our responsible person or responsible officer is the Vice Chancellor.
So you've just got to rely really that people comply with whatever you ask them to comply with, if they're like third party landlords.
Exactly.
By writing to them and stuff and going down the legal route then.
Yes, but you see, the tricky thing is that we don't formally have any influence over them. And this was the problem with Cube, which was that, you know, when it went up in flames, then we had we had a moral duty to help our students, but we didn't have a legal duty. And we were very, very well aware that in doing what we did, it looked like it was our building, which is why, as you saw on the clip there, we were very, very strong to all the media outlets. Look, we're helping here, but this isn't actually ours. Because if we had, let USL do it, then people would have been homeless for weeks.
Yeah, so you've acted on the duty of care, haven't you?
Yes, but not
not
a legal duty of care.
Yeah, we've had a similar sort of thing, away from this meeting in our workplace, where we were establishing that we had a duty of care for things that sort of aren't going to be under our full control, a bit like that. And it does get quite difficult when you're trying to establish duty of care and doing the right thing, and you can only go so far, can't you, in doing the right thing?
Yeah, and it's very complex, and we had no idea of the complexity. I mean, we used to own Orlando and ran it, had our own staff there. It all seemed pretty straightforward, but some of these others, it's a much more complicated situation.
I'm glad I'm not doing your day job, David. I've checked the chat box, and I don't think there's...
No, I think it was only us chatting on it, Michelle. Not me and you.
I think there's a question. Well, Kate Mason's put, the person or organisations collecting rent surely cannot be allowed to throw their hands in the air in these circumstances.
Well, wind back 18 months and you can see just how high they threw their hand. It was all we could do to persuade them to come onto campus to deal with insurance claims. That's, they were more interested in, well, this doesn't mean that you're going to stop paying rent, does it? Just got this smouldering shell of a room. You want to pay rent?
So do you think, are you going to be, one of the questions there, are you going to be looking at getting a building fire safety manager then as a university going forward? Someone who's specifically going to look after all of that?
Yes, I mean, as we develop as a university, then I think that we will begin to need specific fire. I mean, most of our work at the moment is relatively low risk, but that's going to increase as we build, and also a biological advisor as well, because as soon as we start opening a medical school with cadavers and all these sort of things, then that's going to be a whole new health and safety issue, which we'll need to address.
We'll get you back when you start all that, because that's a whole different conversation, isn't it? Whole different conversation. So there's nothing more in the chat.
Okay.
Is anybody on the call? If you want to take your camera off and mute yourself, if you want to ask David anything before he shoots off, feel free to do so. Hello, Paul.
They're all shy, or they're all Zoom ghosting. That's what we call it. They're logged in, but they're not actually there. There we are, Steve.
Hello, Steve. Steve's on our committee.
Right, well, ghost.
Ghost. Yeah, so if there's nothing else, I just really, as the chair, like to say thank you for your time today. And it's been a different subject, something that we don't normally hear about at the Merseyside Branch. So it's been really good to hear a different topic, and I think other people who've joined will getting some decent comments and things. It's just
Splendid.
Sometimes I think when we change the subjects, you can get a bit of a sway on your numbers. But it's been really interesting. I found it really interesting, and thank you very much for your time. So basically, what we do now is bring the meeting to a close, and then we'll go into networking. So
great, thank you very much.
Thanks again, David.
See you again. Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Peter.
Thank you.